This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University. Today, we talk with Victor Ray, F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. Victor is also a non-resident fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and his research applies critical race theory to classic sociological questions. And his work has been published in ASR, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Sociological Theory, among other venues. His work has been funded by the Ford Foundation and the National Science Foundation. Victor has written for the public in places like the Washington Post, the Boston Review, Newsweek. He was director of Conditionally Accepted for Inside Higher Ed. He's written in a bunch of places, including today for the New York Times. Victor is author of On Critical Race Theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care, published in August 2022 by Random House. Our conversation was recorded on Thursday, September 1st, 2022. Thanks for returning to the podcast, Victor. So great to see you.
Of course, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me back.
Great. Well, it's an awesome day to be talking with you because your newest opinion piece with Heather McGhee was published today, as I mentioned, in the New York Times as part of a special section on the purpose of education. And your contribution was titled, School is for Making Citizens. In it, you make the case that teaching a more complete account of American history helps all students fulfill their role as active, engaged members of our political community, particularly history around America's experience with race and racism, white supremacy, and so on. How did that essay come together, and what else should our audience know about it?
Where to start? When you write a book, you pitch a bunch of op-eds related to the book. When I was thinking about who I would like to be in conversation with around issues that came up in the book, Heather McGhee was at the top of my list. I don't know if listeners are familiar with her book, The Sum of Us. I forget the subtitle there, but maybe we can put it in the show notes. That came out fairly recently. And as someone who studies these issues of race and racism, I thought it was one of the best books I had read in a long time. It was hugely accessible, and so I reached out to Heather about collaborating. That's how it came together. The Times reached out and asked Heather to write about that, and then she said, "Do you want to co-write this with me?" And so we did. And I thought it was sort of a good combination of things that interest us both. What Heather calls a solidarity dividend. So in her book, The Sum of Us, she talks about the history of U.S. policy being zero-sum, right? And she has this brilliant metaphor of the history of communities paving over swimming pools in order to disallow black folks from being able to integrate the pool, right? And so the point of this metaphor is that in many, many communities across the United States, white folks were willing to sacrifice their own leisure spaces and their own community spaces and really destroy them rather than share. And she ties that to the history of U.S. policy in a whole bunch of areas, and one of those areas is schooling, right? And so in my work around the critical race theory moral panic, one of the things that I see happening is exactly this. There is a group of mostly white parents out there who are worried about the curriculum integrating and are willing to destroy public schooling rather than share, rather than create space for what's actually any sociologist of race and ethnicity will tell you, basic facts about U.S. history and about racial inequality. The empirical evidence of racial inequality is just overwhelming. And so that's how it came together. And they wanted us, we were asked to provide sort of a positive vision, and the positive vision that we think about that we write about is the freedom schools, which I think maybe listeners know a little bit about this history, but the freedom schools were an initiative of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the mid-1960s that took white and black activists to the South and designed schools that taught, basic remediation for black students because the Jim Crow system of schooling was so abhorrent and underfunded and understaffed intentionally, but it also taught a citizenship curriculum, which was designed to empower the students. And the testimonies of both the teachers who participated in Freedom Summer and the students who came out of it were just that it was a life transforming experience, and it challenged the myth of white superiority and white supremacy that was central to segregated Jim Crow schools, and it empowered the students to, the case we make in the op-ed is like those students and the civil rights movement, as part of the civil rights movement more broadly, literally changed the U.S. and, in our opinion, made it better for everyone. So yeah, I was quite happy to get the opportunity to write with Heather and to get to publish in that outlet.
It's a very good piece. So folks who haven't read it should look it up by the time this airs. One of the things that sticks with me is that you talk about the example of freedom schools, and if we're teaching an honest assessment of the history of race and racism and white supremacy in the United States, we're going to have both negative examples, Jim Crow and lynching and all of the racial terrorism that characterizes a lot of American history. But we're also going to have, examples of the Freedom Riders and the Freedom School and the white Americans that helped, that supported integration, right, and that stood on the side of justice for Black Americans. So this line that sticks with me from your piece is, it's going to allow young white kids to ask themselves, which side do I want to be on? Do I want to be on the side of the jeering crowd when black students integrate Little Rock High School, or do I want to be on the other side?
So I think this is an important point that I make. We're going to talk about my book, or I've written about this in other outlets, is that the folks banning books and attacking CRT are on the side of the white citizens councils and the folks who were against integrated public schools. And there's very little question about that. And I don't think in a lot of places in the sort of mainstream media discussions about critical race theory, I've seen it framed that way, because there's this kind of both sides framing that, they have a point about, this is going to make white children feel bad. And there's an interview from Heather McGhee's podcast in the piece in which a white student is saying, this doesn't make me feel bad. Actually, folks trying to keep this history from me makes me feel bad. It makes me feel like they're hiding something from me. It makes me feel like they're lying to me. And knowing this history actually can help put me on the right side of these future battles, right? And I actually think that that's one of the things that these folks are so afraid of. The folks attacking critical race theory are so afraid of, right? If you look at what Christopher Rufo himself has said about why he tried to start the critical race theory moral panic, he said straight out, this is a response to the protests around George Floyd's murder. And he started reading many of the books that became bestsellers around that time about race and ethnicity. And he said that he saw folks repeatedly citing critical race theorists, and then he went and did his research, and he decided critical race theory was a great weapon to beat back the progress that the movement around George Floyd's murder was trying to make.
Well, I think this is a great kind of segue to your book, and here we're going to just assume that our audience does not know much about critical race theory. After all, most sociologists do not specialize in critical race theory or the study of race and racism in the United States. So could you give those folks a brief overview of the core ideas in critical race theory?
It's interesting, because I think some of the core ideas in critical race theory are actually in line with things you'd get in sort of a race and ethnicity 101 sociology class, or at least in mine, or I think in many folks you would get this, right? So core ideas are things like the social construction of race, which we know very well and take as kind of axiomatic in the social sciences. Structural racism is real, it's persistent, it's long-standing. So I think ideas that are a little bit different or harder for sociologists are some of the challenges around racial progress that critical race theory puts forward. I think ideas like Derek Bell's interest convergence, which the short version here is that Derek Bell says when progress has happened for Black Americans, usually the payoff for white Americans has been equal or greater. I think those are a little more challenging for sociologists, right? I don't think they're integrated into the field in the same way, although there are folks who use those ideas. And then I would also say things like the idea of whiteness as property. But again, I think that is in line with large body of research on things like the racial wealth gap or long-standing racial inequality in economic conditions over the course of U.S. history that sociologists are very familiar with.
I mean, I think it's also probably fair to say that CRT, even from the beginning, drew on some resources in the social sciences, right? The empirical data that folks use to make the arguments they were making about the shape of the law, the effects of legislation like the Civil Rights Act, court decisions like Brown versus Board and so forth, definitely drew on research that was done by sociologists, psychologists, other folks who were interested in racial inequality and racial justice.
So one of the points I make in the book is that critical race theory was interdisciplinary from the start, right? So folks like, if you read Derek Bell or you read Kimberly Crenshaw, as you just pointed out, they are drawing on social science theory and empirical evidence to make points about like the resilience of racial inequality, right? Or what the sort of backlash to the civil rights movement looked like in terms of, attempts to overturn affirmative action or, stalling gains in employment and anti-discrimination law. And, those folks were conversant with the social science evidence. The other thing I'll say is that, if you read Crenshaw, she talks about being, I think, an African American Studies undergrad and how that influenced the way she approached the law, and that's infused in critical race theory. And then, so one of the things I talk about in the book is the shared progenitors of some aspects of the study of race in sociology, like the Du Boisian tradition that's become more prominent recently, but has always been sort of an undercurrent for some folks, and like critical race theorists draw on folks like Du Bois all the time.
Well, your book is a tightly packed 10 chapters. It's not this is not a doorstop book. It's a very accessible book that covers the main ideas from CRT and some, as we mentioned, from the sociology of race and racism, like social construction of race, structural and colorblind racism, racial progress, interest convergence, whiteness as property, counter narratives, racialized organizations, which comes from your work, of course, intersectionality and identity politics. That's a lot of things to pack in one book, Victor. What work did you want this book to do for academic and maybe especially non-academic audiences?
So, I don't know that I expected it to do all that much for academic audiences, which might seem kind of weird. I feel like for academic audiences, I could see this book being adopted in intro race courses because I think it introduces both some key ideas from critical race theory, a couple of key ideas from the social sciences, and then a lot of social science evidence behind those ideas. But really, I was trying to intervene in public debates, which I think have been, in some cases, so, if you say someone has been fundamentally dishonest, it sounds as if you are impugning their character or lying about them. But let me just be clear. Christopher Rufo tweeted, I am doing a bad paraphrase because I don't have my book in front of me to read the exact quote, but the tweet was something like, we are trying to like cram together all these ideas Americans don't like, call it critical race theory, and just like demonize the brand, right? And so so it's not me saying this is a sort of intellectually dishonest approach, it's them saying it, right? And I think that one of the things that I was trying to do was sort of thread the needle between saying like, this is, again, them not me, an admittedly dishonest approach to a very important body of scholarship that is designed to describe in the hopes of changing or intervening in long-standing racial inequality. And here's some folks with a very different agenda who don't know this literature, who are not interested in describing or changing in racial inequality, who are interested in motivating racism for political benefit, who are lying about these ideas. And so, you know, you run the risk, if you're arguing with people without sort of intellectual standards, you run the risk of getting caught in a game of moving goalposts. So my strategy in the book was to say, like, look, these folks are admittedly dishonest. The ideas from critical race theory are, you know, at least 40 years old from the time that critical race theory sort of came together, but ideas about social construction or structural racism stretch long before that. These are enduring intellectual traditions that I don't think the general public knows that much about. I was trying to write a book that people acting in good faith who are like, I am confused about this debate, can pick up, read, say, this is a defense of this set of ideas from someone who has studied it and thinks they're important. And I tried to avoid, again, you know, engaging in a whole bunch of bad faith arguments. Really, I talk about those bad faith arguments in, like, the introduction, and I think that's mostly it, right? I think I talk about, you know, some bad faith arguments around intersectionality in the later chapter.
I mean, it is a kind of amazing strategy to announce that you're going to intentionally lie about a body of scholarship in order to brand a whole set of things that aren't really at the core of that body of scholarship as bad, in order to make, you know, broad sweeping misrepresentations. And then the question is, for what? You know, like, if you're gonna so brazenly lie, like, what's the point? Because I think Rufo and others clearly do have a point. They're not doing this for, like, fun or just to have something to do. They have an agenda.
Yeah, so I mean, they absolutely have a point. And I mean, they've told us that too, right? So, one, this, you know, I've said in a lot of interviews and in the book, I say, like, critical race theory explained the backlash to the civil rights movement. Like, it literally arose to explain, like, what happened and why the strategy that was so effective for civil rights lawyers for so long in sort of improving the condition of black folks and other people of color in the U.S. Was no longer working, or like the backlash, right? And Rufo and his ilk have literally said, we're trying to create a backlash to the George Floyd movement, right? Like, our goal is to stop this. And then, you know, it's spread since then. It's been used in sort of like, I think his name, Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, right? So it's been used around for electoral politics. The GOP has said it's going to be part of their sort of midterm strategy, is like stoking this. And then I think the other thing is Rufo's been clear about his goal of like privatizing public education. And so the strategy here, I mean, they've told us that too, so there's not a lot of like wonder or, you know, it's not that mysterious, I guess, is the way to say it. I think the other thing here, I want to say two things about the sort of like strategy of sowing confusion, right? Or saying like I am going to be intellectually dishonest about this, but it doesn't matter. And I think, one, Trump was just president, and lots of folks learned that the media would treat blatant lies as at least something worth covering and provide some kinds of credibility to things that were easily disproven falsehoods, because they're invested in this idea that there are two sides rather than there's empirical evidence and then there's folks making shit up. Excuse me, but like that's the way this is, right? And then the other thing I'll say here is that there was a Rufo used to work for the Discovery Institute, and I wrote about this for an article in Time that I called Critical Race Theory's Merchants of Doubt. I don't know if any listeners remember the Discovery Institute, but in the 90s, they were the folks pushing what they called intelligent design in schools in order to undermine teaching about evolutionary theory in biology classes and insert into schools the, sort of Christian nationalist idea of creationism. And so part of their strategy was to not necessarily say evolution was wrong, but they were like, teach the debate, right? Now, among biologists, there was no debate. Right? Just like among sociologists of race and ethnicity, most of them are going to be like, yeah, there's a broad consensus that structural racism is real. But they knew that sowing enough confusion was a strategy that would, again, create doubt in some folks' minds. I don't know what to believe, and it creates a space for them to convert folks to their belief set. And the reason I called it Critical Race Theory's Merchants of Doubt is this was a strategy that not just the Discovery Institute used, but there's this great book by a couple of historians whose names I am also blanking on, called Merchants of Doubt, and it chronicles the history of corporations using this exact strategy around things like the scientific consensus on global warming, the scientific consensus on the dangers of smoking cigarettes, the scientific consensus on acid rain. And the strategy was to undermine the science just enough so that folks in the general population would not know what to believe. And then that created political space for, them to keep selling cigarettes and kill a whole bunch more people, or for us to all be experiencing to different degrees the impact of climate change because they were able to stall political progress. And so this is not a mystery what they are doing, and it's been incredibly frustrating to me for them to just say it and then watch the media do the same thing they've done repeatedly, because they operate in this, in my opinion, outdated idea of both sides objectivity, view from nowhere, that it just doesn't exist.
So just for folks who are interested in that book, it's Merchants of Doubt, and the subtitle is How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. It's one of my favorite books, actually, that talks about the construction of ignorance and the obfuscation and ginning up of controversy, as Victor, you're talking about. The authors are Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. So folks who are interested in that, maybe we'll put that in the show notes for people who want to follow that forward. But it is, what you're saying is, Rufo and other people who are in this field, they really know how to play the media, right? Because the media has a track record of reporting both sides as if their goal is to just report both sides and not try to report what can be empirically demonstrated faithfully, right? Well, I'm curious about the reception of your book. As I was saying, it's a book that you pitch to people who are curious about this topic, maybe have heard about CRT, but aren't sure exactly what it is. The chapters are relatively short. They're punchy. They're really clear. How have folks responded to the book? Maybe non-academic audiences or folks who are less familiar with this tradition of scholarship.
I think the response has been great. I always wonder if people hated it, if they just wouldn't tell me. So that could be it. But the response from it's gotten a couple of reviews, and the reviews have been positive. The sort of Goodreads and Amazon reviews are positive, and people who've read it again have told me that they enjoyed it. As with almost everything I write, I got a couple of hate mails, a couple of pieces of hate mail. Some of them were relatively incoherent, so I didn't put too much stock in them. And yeah, I think I think it takes a while to figure out if a book like this met my goals.
Yeah, look, we're talking to you basically about a month-ish since the book was officially released.
Yeah, actually tomorrow will be a month.
I was going to say, one arrived on publication day at my house, and then another arrived a few days later. I had ordered 2 copies. I had pre-ordered two copies. I've given one away already to a student who expressed some confusion about critical race theory. So I was like, hey, do I have the book for you? Here it is. We'll see what he thinks. Well, I want to go back a little bit to the anti-CRT moral panic, and it seems to me that there's a new branch in this, or maybe new front in this kind of culture war. Chris Rufo and others have now added anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ plus moral panics to this. What do you make of this? Is this another line in the attack on public goods, public education, that kind of thing, or something else going on in your view?
First, let me start by saying in some ways, this to me is, I don't know if more worrying. This is incredibly dangerous and has put folks at real physical risk, right? So there have been just this week bomb threats called into a hospital in a children's hospital, I believe, in Boston Children's, because these folks have, talked about trans-affirming surgery in ways that are untrue and violent. And so some unhinged folks reacted to that. There was Proud Boys storming drag shows. I think these things are incredibly dangerous. And I think one of the things that I've written about and I think is important to talk about in terms of critical race theory is interest convergence. So I'm just going to talk, and this might take a while. But in Derek Bell's discussion of interest convergence, one of the things that he talks about is Brown v. Board, right? And so if you remember, I said interest convergence is the idea that benefits for white Americans, when policy has benefited Black Americans, it's typically equal or greater benefits for white Americans. And Brown v. Board is a really kind of case in which you would think that doesn't make much sense. And so Derek Bell, I think, chose a really conservative example, and he says, look, in the South, since the end of Reconstruction, everyone knew that segregation was immoral. The immorality of segregation was part of the point, right? It was we are going to make it impossible for Black folks, Black students, to learn about the world in a basic descriptive way, have enough skills to compete in any economy, and to, outside of sort of the most menial jobs, and make it impossible for them to exercise the vote or gain any political power. So like the immorality was the point. And Derek Bell says there were always some white folks who were opposed to this, but not enough to overcome the sort of transience of the white South that was for segregation. And he says what changed around Brown v. Board wasn't the morals of that segment of white America. It was the threat of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union effectively using propaganda about racism in the United States to get decolonizing states to join the sort of Soviet bloc in the Cold War, right? And so you have these cables from the State Department saying, like, we support desegregating schools because we're losing this war for proxy states with the Soviet Union. And Derek Bell says that's what's changed, and that was what became determinative, is that a group of elite white Americans recognized that keeping schools segregated was harming the U.S. project internationally. And so I think what's different right now, and what's part of, I think, is driving both the CRT moral panic, the spread of that moral panic to LGBTQ issues, and I think the sort of retrograde decisions in the Supreme Court last session, is that those external checks have broken down. If you look at what the US right is doing now, they're not fighting communism, they are looking to authoritarian states and Christian nationalist states as models for the future. If you look at, and again, you don't have to take my word for it, you have Ron DeSantis saying, actually, we're looking at Hungary to figure out how to implement anti-CRT and anti-trans laws in our state, right? You have the years of sort of Putin worship among some on the right, and Donald Trump's various forms of obeisance to Putin when he was president. So like they're very clear. And so I've written about this, and the argument I make is like we've entered a period of interest divergence. We've entered a period in which those external checks on how bad certain segments of the U.S. polity could treat internal minorities have broken down. And without social movements or without some sort of, external pressure, that really scares me. And so what I think is happening, again, drawing on CRT theory, what I think is happening is that we've hit a kind of interest divergence where those historical checks are no more. Doesn't bode well for the future.
No, and in many ways, you can imagine a return to very draconian, very oppressive policies where folks are. I mean, some folks on the right are actually talking about rounding up certain minority groups, right, and placing them in special camps and things that definitely seem to be authoritarian and fascist in their implications.
Oftentimes, the way the media covers this stuff, or the way it gets talked about, is like, oh, look, there's this crazy thing happening over here with CRT, and over here we have, like, these issues with voting rights, right? And so, like, the design of the media is like you have one person covering schools, and you have one person covering voting rights. And, like, I'm like, look, those are the same movement, right? And, like, not only are they the same movement, they're drawing on the same sort of well of national support, because the same organizations funding the anti-voting stuff are tied to the anti-CRT stuff in schools, and the same well of international sort of rising authoritarianism in which they borrow and remix ideas to the local context. So, yeah, I'll stop.
Well, it is very frightening, and obviously a direct challenge to any kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that was in the process of being formed. I don't know that we can say we've ever gotten there as a country, but just when protests like around the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, a bunch of other, Black Americans, causes folks many people, even a lot of white people, to question the kind of status quo. Right? You get these backlashes, which is what CRT would predict in a lot of ways. Well, on that note, it's not over for attacks on racial justice and on critical race theory. And part of what I want to do with this question is just make everyone aware that UCLA's Race Forward project, which is part of their critical race concentration and program at their law school, is tracking statements from school boards and local governments, legislation that's been proposed and laws passed about CRT restricting the teaching of so-called divisive concepts or controversial concepts or anything that would make a student uncomfortable. And by a student, the imagined student appears to be a white student, about racial justice and racial history. Can you help us understand historical parallels or other times in our past that could help us explain what's going on with these like legislative proposals and laws?
I published this New York Times op-ed today with Heather McGhee, and one of the things that, like, when it was being fact-checked, so, I wrote, we wrote that, the Jim Crow system taught racial inferiority and white superiority, right? It was a white supremacist system. And, one of the things that really shocked me in the fact-check was, they were like, do you have evidence for this? And so, it did a couple of things for me. One was I thought about Jenny Mueller's work, who you've had on, in terms of sort of racial ignorance, right? And what do you think the point of a Jim Crow school was, right? The point of segregating schools was segregation itself is about white supremacy and racial superiority, right? It's not just about difference. But also, the point of Jim Crow schools was to reinforce that, right? The point of Jim Crow rituals of, making folks step off the sidewalk or separate water fountains were all about teaching racial inferiority. And so, and actually, the curriculum also taught racial inferiority, right? There were, Black students weren't allowed to learn about things like the Constitution. There were, as I talk about in the op-ed, many employers only wanted Black folks to learn just enough to do their jobs, right? They recognized education as a threat to the Jim Crow system. And so, I had citations, that wasn't the issue. But the issue to me was, this is an incredible question, because, also, how has our current school system failed so miserably that this question would ever be asked, right? The entire point of Jim Crow was racial superiority and racial inferiority. And so, to be clear, that is not an indictment of, the fact checker, right? That is an indictment of, how we think and talk about race, and, how deluded the ideas around, I don't know, being asked to prove that the Jim Crow system taught racial inferiority just was, mind-blowing to me, right? But it was mind-blowing in the sense of, it's something that I take for granted and I don't feel like I should have to explain, but also, the need to explain that, to me, says something broader about the way folks who don't think about this stuff all the time or aren't sort of, inundated with it all the time, might react to, a basic fact. Again, I don't know that this might need to be edited closely, because I don't want to cast aspersions on the fact checker, because they were doing their job, right? And I get it, but
it's a good example of just how I think what you're saying is, what is it about our education systems that make it unclear to people that segregated schools in Jim Crow and even, to some extent perhaps today, even now, right, are subtly and not so subtly, maybe not so subtly, further back in the past, and even today, right, are teaching a racialized curriculum of racial hierarchy, injustice, exclusion, and oppression, such that the main characters of history are, the founding fathers. And you talk about, and I think this is in your piece, you talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and, it's mentioned that they had anti-slavery views. What's not as often mentioned is that they held slaves. They were slaveholders, right?
Yeah. So we didn't link. I'll just say we didn't link, but that was actually directly in response to Ron DeSantis' civics curriculum. That was folks, this was reported on a few weeks ago, in which he was training teachers and saying Washington and Jefferson had anti-slavery views, and neglecting to tell those teachers, right, in the training, that also, Jefferson had owned more than 600 people over the course of his life, and Washington's dentures were made out of slaves' teeth, right? So this was not foreign or, not part of their legacy. In Washington's case, it was literally foundational to his ability to function, right? The slave system allowed him to keep eating, not even metaphorically from the proceeds, but quite literally through, incorporating parts of it into his body. And so, I think there's a real effort to suppress those facts, and I think that effort has been ongoing, right? So I think that effort has been ongoing, and in fairness, there's always been resistance to it, right? There's always been folks pushing for education and an honest education, but I think the effort to sort of hide and obfuscate basic facts about America's racial history has been an ongoing one.
I mean, one thing that I think Phil Gorski tweeted the other day was when these restrictions get passed, you're going to get a history curriculum in which the main players are white Protestant heterosexual men, and everyone else is in video game parlance, an NPC, a non-playable character. They're just there to support, the main action. They have anonymous roles. You're not going to get stories of any of the freedom fighters, Black American freedom fighters, because they are just bit players in white people working out the promise of America, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that the evidence around the kind of books that are getting banned, like schools are banning books about Dr. King and about Rosa Parks, right? Basic, and I would say if you read they were revolutionaries, right? Dr. King and Rosa Parks were revolutionaries, and they changed the world. But that's been sanitized in much of the sort of way they're discussed publicly and the way they're taught in schools. And so even banning the sanitized versions, to me, is just incredible, right? It's an incredible fear of the truth of what this country has done to Black people and is doing through banning these stories.
Yeah, the racial oppression, the white supremacy and racial oppression has certainly not ended. And if you're afraid of a true multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where people actually have voting rights and are not gerrymandered out of their political power, and know enough about history to recognize the problems with our current systems, then you're going to lose your power, right? I mean, you're going to lose these unjust gains that have been made by keeping folks out of their rightful place in society. All right, well, I have lots of questions left, but so I'm going to make some choices here. My sense is that CRT has not made serious inroads within sociology as much as it could, to use a Southernism, outside perhaps the study of racism and white supremacy and education. Where do you see the most potential for CRT-inspired projects within sociology? The areas maybe most ready for insights to be harvested from CRT or used to develop that line of work.
I don't know about this question because I might punt on this one. Just for the fact that, like, I don't want to say something about subfields I don't know that much about. Right? Like, I don't think that's fair. So, like, to scholars whose work I respect, right? Even if I don't know that much about it, like, I'm not going to say. The one thing I will say is, like, one of my personal goals was to bring it into the study of organizations, bring critical race theory into the study of organizations. And I've also, like, focused a lot on thinking about racial progress, and I hope that has implications beyond the sort of immediate subfields of race and ethnicity and the study of orgs. Like, I know, like, a lot of folks in education are thinking about that, but I would say also that, like, as you said in the intro to this question, education, CRT has been pretty prominent in education for quite a while, because the discussion of, like, the distribution of resources, educational resources, the history of underfunding and segregated education in the United States is in line with a lot of CRT claims. But yeah, I don't want to take a swipe at folks.
No, I don't know. I know the intent of the question is not to call a field out and just say, like, sociology of health and medicine, which is a field that I am associated with, hasn't. I mean, it's not that health and medicine hasn't attended to racial injustice or racial inequity. At the same time, it would be really interesting to think about major innovations in health policy, like the Affordable Care Act, for example. And how could we explain both the rise of that or the passage of that bill, and of course then the backlash to it, in ways that are consistent with CRT principles? And I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. So I think maybe I would say, again, to sort of, like, shift from your direct question, like, the stuff on Christian nationalism that's been coming out, and Glenn Bracey has a recent article that I haven't read yet, but I will say that, like, the stuff on Christian nationalism and there's a number of folks talking about the sort of, like, overlap of race and religion. So Atiya Hussein was one of the first folks I read on this. Zaher Salad's work also, I think, touched on this around, like, sort of the racialization of Muslims. And so I would say not so much a area that could learn from, but, like, I have learned a lot from those folks, and I had, for, like, sort of personal and political reasons, like, my own sort of, like, anti-religious bias that was personal, but then also influenced the way I thought about, like, the study of religion. And those folks have made me, like, well, they showed me I was wrong, right? They showed me I was wrong, and that I needed to be taking religion much more seriously than I had. And then the thing that did to me, it was just, like, the way, critical race theorists often talk about, like, racial ignorance, right? I would say I had kind of an ignorance around religion in which, like, there were things that I just, like, did not want to deal with. And, like, after, like, reading some of that stuff, I was like, oh, this should have made sense to me, because the classic work around religion being so central to mobilization in the civil rights movement, right? And like the civil rights movement would not have happened without those religious organizations and the sort of community that grew up around them. And so, like, I see Christian nationalism as a kind of backlash to that, that's using a very similar set of, religious strategies, or you could say movement strategies, to mobilize and to create what I consider really negative social change, but social change nonetheless. So yeah, I would say that.
I mean, I personally have been reading a lot of CRT stuff. I mean, obviously your book and Cheryl Harris, Whiteness is Property. But this is not about my reading list. But I've also been reading a lot of white Christian nationalism stuff, and have talked about it in public here at Abilene Christian University. And I do think there is a great deal of things that you can learn by putting these two conversations together, especially because so much of the focus of white Christian nationalists is on the training of children and creating institutions like private Christian schools, and then getting those schools funded by public dollars and taking dollars away from publicly funded schools that cannot do the kinds of discriminatory things that white Christian schools can do. And obviously there's a connection between white Christian schools and the civil rights movement, segregation, the response to Brown versus Board, all of those sorts of things. If you put these things in a line, you can see how the response of white Christian Americans, but Protestant white Christian, and not Catholics too, but more conservative, right-wing, so-called traditionalist white Christians have been in perpetual backlash against movements towards racial equity and justice in the United States. And people like Randall Ballmer have written about this from the historian's kind of point of view. Obviously, people like Whitehead and Perry, and then Gorski and Perry more recently. There's a great series of articles that Perry has been working on for a long time, and Whitehead as well. So obviously point folks to all of them. And my very first episode I hosted of the Annex Solo was with Sam Perry. So folks can go back and listen to that on Christian nationalism. But he's been coming out with stuff recently about white Christian nationalism, and particularly, and obviously the book Flag and the Cross with Gorski is also about white Christian nationalism as well. So I really do think that there are important substantive kind of overlaps in here, and that really views of race and racial justice, racial inequality, white supremacy hold the key to a lot of explaining what's going on.
I'll be brief with this, but I also think it's really interesting what you just added, in that a lot of the resistance and attacks on critical race theory also come from white Christian nationalist tradition, right? And so they feel very threatened by some folks feel very threatened by CRT and what it says about the U.S.
Right. Well, it violates some of those narratives that white Christian nationalists hold to in terms of what they call liberty, order, like liberty, freedom, and order, or something like that. All right. Well, let's transition here. I want to talk about liberalism and the liberal tradition in the United States. I think this is one of the things that my reading of CRT puts in my head, is that CRT critiques abstract liberalism, that idea that suggests that the U.S. is meritocratic, provides opportunity for everyone who tries hard enough, that the playing fields are level, that education is a driver of mobility, that any kind of racial bias is on the individual level and not structural in nature, and so on. So can you tell us about CRT's critique of liberalism? And I know some folks are reading certain CRT scholars, and they're suggesting that scholarship is wanting to chuck at least that abstract version of liberalism. Others think liberalism can be saved, rehabilitated in certain ways. How do you think about that?
I want to start with the part of your question when you were talking about like meritocracy, the ability to move up, the American dream, bootstrapping. Like, let me just say that like I don't think any sociologist can look at the evidence and buy any of that narrative in the U.S. right now, right? So between between rising inequality, between the sort of like it's become increasingly difficult for people to move up the class ladder. I just think that like that narrative, and not even talking about like people of color, but that narrative even for white folks, if you look at like the literature on deaths of despair and those things, like that era of sort of the ability to move up in certain ways is I wouldn't say over, but like it's definitely greatly decreased, right? So I'll start there. As far as the critique of liberalism, the person I think about here like the most, and probably has influenced me like probably more than any other CRT thinker except maybe Bonilla Silva, is Charles Mills, who wrote The Racial Contract, and in The Racial Contract goes after like Locke and Kant and early liberal thinkers, and shows that like they didn't consider black folks or people of color human, right? He has this distinction between white and non-white, and he says that white folks were written into this social contract, people of color were written out of the social contract, and so the extension of rights, the extension of human rights, the extension of like contract law, the extension of like recognition, never happened for those folks. Now, a thing that like shocks me about Mill's thought, and like I don't know what to make of, is like he wrote The Racial Contract, and then he spent like a large portion of the rest of his career trying to come up with an inclusive liberalism that got beyond those issues, right? And so for me, I would say that like the issue with liberalism and abstract liberalism in its, the way critical race theorists critique it, is not that they're opposed to equality. It's that has always been a partial sort of, commitment for liberals. And so I'll say that. Do I think it is a project that can be sort of repaired? I don't know. That's not my project as a thinker. I'll say, like, I have so much respect for Mills that I like take that attempt very seriously. The other thing that I would say is, if the other way I think about this is Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, right? So we talk about abstract liberalism, and he says white moderates, but I think of this as a critique of liberalism, and he says that they're more devoted to order than to justice, and so they let injustice go on instead, in order to keep order, in order to not have their lives disturbed. And I think a lot of liberalism is that way. If you read Bonilla Silva's work on abstract liberalism, it's like, yeah, I support integrated schools in theory until it harms me and my kid, or until I lose the privileges I get from going to an all-white school in a rich community. And so the critique of abstract liberalism is not about the idea of equality or equal opportunity. It's about the unwillingness to give up sort of material gains that folks get from inequality, or the unwillingness to have like any form of inconvenience or personal sacrifice. And I think that's hard, right? I think that's the whole problem, right? Right? Like some folks would say that's the whole problem. So how do you get folks to share?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, maybe, Mills is saying the problem with abstract liberalism is it never lived up to its own promise, and part of its promise is recognizing the harm that it has overlooked in the past, and then taking affirmative steps to redress that harm, such that barriers to achieving, those principles can actually be made real.
So, yeah, I'm reading. So I'm only about halfway through it. Taiwo's book, Reconsidering Reparations, and he draws on Mills. And like I just finished this section last night. I didn't take notes, but like one of the things that he argues in the book is like we need to think about ends, right? We need to think about outcomes. And one of the things that liberalism does is like, look, if we have like formal equality in the law, if we have a colorblind set of rules, then we fix the problem. And what Taiwo is saying and what I think Mills is saying is like, actually, we need to look at the outcomes. And if the outcomes are still greatly unequal, that's sort of good evidence on its face that the problem has not been addressed, right? And so I think, the critique of abstract liberalism is that it's abstract, that it's not in practice, and that's what folks are trying to get to.
I love this kind of conversation, which feels appropriately academic and nerdy for the annex. So great. I do want to give people a sense of the especially striking, I'm calling them zingers, the zingers in the book. So for example, you discuss how MLK's I Have a Dream speech has been misrepresented by those who want to make Dr. King out to be colorblind. The line from your book is, misrepresenting Dr. King's quote on the color of one's skin says a lot about the content of one's character. And another favorite is when you write about banning books like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, you say, America's history is disturbing and a healthy society would be disturbed. So maybe help us think about your writing process here. How did you approach writing a book for this public audience? And those of us who want to write zingers, how do we come up with these, Victor?
Like, I have often chafed at the restrictions of academic writing quite a bit. And so, writing for the public, you can say what you want, how you want to say it. And, your editor might say, take this out or it's too much. But I think the kind of hedging that you have to do in academic work, I didn't feel necessarily compelled to do. So that line about Dr. King, I'll say that comes from a personal pet peeve that I'm sure many other folks have, is that that's the one quote conservatives know from Dr. King. They take it out of context and they absolutely misrepresent his thought, right? Dr. King supported affirmative action. He was very clear on that. He knew that after several centuries of race-based social policy that disadvantaged people of color and black folks in particular, that in order to fix that, you had to have race-based social policy aimed at alleviating what race-based social policy had caused, right? Prior racist social policy had caused. So the other reason that was a pet peeve was when I was running Conditionally Accepted, and we published a piece almost every week for 2 years. It was a ton of work, and it was many marginalized scholars of color, and there was a comments section, and every week in the comments section, almost every week, it felt like every week, someone would come use that quote. Right? And so again, that quote is pure abstract liberalism, to go back to what we were just talking about, right? So they especially in the decontextualized way, they're using it outside of, what Dr. King meant. And so I just had I just get very irritated. I would write to my authors and be you made it. They used the quote, right? I know you hit a nerve. It was four comments down, so I know you hit a nerve because they used this quote. So that was why that one came. The other one, the second one you used about sort of being disturbed, is part of the narrative around these critical race theory bans is just like grotesque to me, in that, so you have white parents saying white children learning about the history of slavery is going to disturb their kids, right? And so I'm thinking about this woman in Virginia whose teenage son read Beloved, and then she said something like he had trouble sleeping after reading Beloved because he was so disturbed. And like, first of all, as a mixed race person going through America's schools, public schools, like I was often disturbed, right? Like by like white supremacy in the curriculum and teachers not stepping in when something racist in the classroom happened, right? Two, and like education itself is disturbing, right? Like you often learn things that are hard to integrate into how you viewed the world before, like that should be it. And finally, like, I've said this a lot, but yeah, the history of, like, U.S. history is, in some cases, just like, there were war crimes, crimes against humanity, a couple of genocides. That is disturbing. And it is normal to be disturbed. I don't use this quote in the book, but there's a Baldwin quote that I use that is like, Baldwin says, part of getting an education, if you develop a moral conscience, is when this happens, you will be at war with your society, right? Like you. Oh, that's great. That's great. So I think about that quote a lot, and like you are at war with your society when you develop this conscience, because if you're honest, your society has done some upsetting things. I don't see learning about that as damaging to kids unless you don't want your kid to have that moral growth. I'm really afraid that these parents banning this stuff, as we said in the op-ed today, do you want to be on the side of the folks, screaming at Ruby Bridges, or do you want to be on the folks like helping her integrate the school on that side? And I think these parents, they're on the side of the folks screaming at Ruby Bridges, and they're worried about their kids being on the other side.
Folks, there are a lot more zingers in the book, not just those two. So there are many reasons to read on critical race theory, but the excellent turns of phrase like that are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Well, I want to transition now to our banter segment where we talk about things not related exactly to what our guest has been writing and thinking about. One of the things that we discussed just chatting about was the notion of quiet quitting, and both in academia and not. And I personally have been critical of this this framing of the phenomenon, and I know you are too, Victor. So why would you say quiet quitting? Well, first of all, what is quiet quitting? And then why is that such a terrible framework for worker action inside and outside academia?
So I don't know what quiet quitting is because it's just sort of a nonsensical concept. But I think what folks are trying to say is a bunch of people have chosen to not do parts, well, they're not even parts of their job, to not do things their job asks them to do for which they are not compensated. So, for us, that would be maybe sort of a lot of extra reviewing for journal articles. We could make the argument that some of that is built into what we should be doing for the job, but then, it can get excessive if you're getting a request every day. Or, events after work, or other parts of the job that you are not formally contracted to do. I can't think of a reason that this is a good frame, which was, you said, like, why is this a bad frame? I can't think of a reason that this is a good frame unless you were trying to, exploit people and steal extra labor from them. So from the boss's perspective, it's a good frame. From my perspective, it's people trying to get me to do work that I'm not paid for, even though the terms of the contract says I should be paid for my work. So yeah, and yeah, I have no idea why this term became so prominent so quickly, and it's not quitting. Like like,
Well, I mean, from my read, and I haven't read a ton of articles on this, I guess my view on it is, as people who have white collar jobs or knowledge workers or people who have not been classified as essential workers in the pandemic, as they return to the office, or as they push back against returning to the office, there was some time to kind of re-examine what used to be called work-life balance. And I think there's probably a new management name for that kind of concept. But the idea is that there ought to be some separation between what one does for paid employment and what one does in other aspects of their life. And so when there are disruptive moments, it's a time for people to, both individually and sort of collectively in their households and communities and so forth, just kind of renegotiate the terms under which they were working before. And so, universities are known as greedy institutions. And so to the extent that any time at home on Zoom, or in the classroom, managing a Zoom classroom plus an in-person classroom plus people who are out with COVID or other illnesses and so forth, may have caused a lot of people to sort of reconsider how they are being valued and really the effort they put in for the compensation that they're provided. And obviously right now there's a lot of discussion about inflation, and I don't know about your salary, but mine did not go up dramatically when costs increased for several things. Anyway, I'm happy to hear what you have to say in response.
I didn't disagree with anything you said there. I would just add, universities reacted to the pandemic in various ways. But my job actually, showed very clearly that, it did not care about putting us at substantial risk, potentially even up to and including death, right? We had no mask mandate, we had no vaccine mandate, and we were not allowed to even tell people to wear masks in our classroom, right? And this was despite some faculty outcry, this was despite graduate student organizing. And so, there was maybe, I've never been the institution loves me, but whatever sort of informal social contract existed before the pandemic about they will take care of us in the most basic of ways, in which that is ensure that I am not put in harm's way needlessly, they showed that they weren't willing to do that. And so I guess again, back to this concept of quiet quitting, it is entirely rational in that case to not go above and beyond for an organization that has shown in the starkest of terms that it does not care about you. And so this is another way in which I think the term is just really bad, because it places the onus for this reaction on individuals adjusting to an altered workplace relationship, right? In which it was made very clear that you're literally expendable, on the individual, rather than saying most of the major institutions in American society failed to deal with this in a constructive way, and we need to think about how to alleviate that and alleviate some of these harms. And so, it's the classic sort of anti-sociological psychologizing move, and that happens a lot in sort of the popular media when it comes to massive structural changes. Is they're it's lean in, right? Oh, you have a ton of discrimination against women in the workplace. Work harder, right? We showed we don't care about you living or dying, and well, you still owe us all of this non-contractual labor. Like, it doesn't make sense, and it inverts the power relationship in a really weird way.
I mean, one thing that I was just thinking of, it sounds like it almost pathologizes this rational response to the demonstrated, lack of support and lack of care, right? Basic care for employees. And I mean, in my particular context, we're a small liberal arts college, and there are many times in which institutional leaders draw on a language of community, sometimes even family, that plays into this notion that you should go above and beyond for your family. You should show up for the midnight breakfast and serve pancakes to students right before finals week and things like that. And no shade against people who think that's a good thing for them to do, but it does contribute to this culture and sense that you ought to be working well beyond the confines of your contractual, like, obligated labor to the university.
Yeah, I agree with that. So my situation is different here, but there are lots of ways that I think I go beyond this sort of strict contracted labor. But those are, they're, who knows, maybe I'm like kidding myself, but at least some of those feel like, oh, these are things I want to do, and it's very different than saying, like, these are things I'm compelled to do, or like I risk, my job, or I risk, like, the ability to be promoted, or the ability to get, like, sort of recognition. And I feel like the quiet quitting narrative is the latter. It's like focused on, you're not going, as you said it earlier, you're not going above and beyond, and so that's harming the company when that's not part of the deal. To do that work.
Yeah, when the company should be paying other laborers to do that as part of their regular job description. Great. Well, Victor, it's such a pleasure to talk with you. How should people stay in touch with your work?
I mean, the easiest way is just follow me on Twitter, where I spend too much time.
All right, that's at Victor Eric Ray, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Eric with a K.
All right. Well, awesome. As I said, Victor, always great to talk with you. Congratulations on the book. Folks should definitely pick it up. And your work on racialized organizations, your work on all of the rest of your work is just great. And we're so thrilled to have you on the Annex. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, you've been listening to the Annex. I'm Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University. Thanks so much to Victor Ray. Thanks to Joe Cohen, who directs the Queen's Podcast Lab, and to our fantastic producers. Music by Lena Orsa. Thanks so much, Lena.